For weeks, Iran believed it had already won. Fast boats were swarming merchant traffic. Drone swarms were harassing tankers. Naval mines were scattered through the shipping lanes like a waiting death trap. And behind all of it stood an entire network of anti-ship missile launchers buried so deep underground that conventional weapons were never supposed to reach them. Those launchers were aimed not just at ships, but at the throat of the global economy itself. And Tehran looked at that whole architecture and felt untouchable. Then the United States dropped a bomb that changed the equation. Literally. 5,000 pounds of precision-guided force slammed into Iran's hardened coastal missile sites along the Strait of Hormuz. And these were not ordinary bombs. This was a weapon so new, so powerful, and so consequential that military analysts are still trying to grasp what its combat use means for hardened underground military infrastructure everywhere. Because once a weapon like that enters the battlefield, the rules begin to change. Now look, I have been in that chair. I know what it feels like when the pressure is enormous, when the clock is ticking, when every option looks risky and every delay looks dangerous. But I also learned something in those years that I still carry with me. If your allies will not stand with you, that does not automatically mean they are weak. It may mean your strategy needs a second look. And when even your friends will not follow your lead, that tells you something important. We will come back to that in a moment. Because the honest truth is this: the measure of American strength was never just how many ships we could deploy, or how many planes we could launch, or how many threats we could issue. The real measure was always how many nations we could bring with us, whether our power generated trust, whether our decisions created alignment, whether our allies saw our cause as their cause. And right now, on that score, we are coming up short. Let me walk you through how we got here. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched airstrikes on Iran. They killed the supreme leader. They hit military targets, government buildings, and civilian infrastructure. Iran responded with missiles, with drones, and by closing the Strait of Hormuz. Now, if you do not know what the Strait of Hormuz is, let me explain it as plainly as I can. It is a narrow waterway, just 21 miles wide at its narrowest point between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. And through that little strip of ocean passes roughly 20% of the world's oil and liquefied natural gas every single day. It is one of the most consequential choke points in the entire global economy. So when Iran shut it down, this was not an abstract problem for diplomats in conference rooms. This was not just a briefing point at the Pentagon or a headline on cable television. This was the price of gasoline in Ohio, the heating bill for a family in Manchester, the fertilizer costs for a farmer in Punjab. It touched freight, food, transport, inflation, energy, and confidence all at once. The whole global economy felt it. Brent crude went from around $70 a barrel to over $100. Stock markets fell. Governments started preparing contingency plans. Countries began hoarding fuel. The effect was immediate because the Strait of Hormuz is not simply important. It is systemically important. It is one of those places where a regional conflict stops being regional the moment trade stops moving. Then came the ceasefire on April 8th, 2 weeks brokered by Pakistan. Then came the Islamabad talks, with Vice President Vance and Iran's foreign minister sitting across from one another for 21 hours. 21 hours of direct engagement in what many people hoped might become the opening phase of a broader diplomatic process. And then those talks failed. Iran said the United States had excessive demands and constantly changing positions. Vance said the ball was in the Iranian court. And then on Sunday night, April 12th, rather than allowing Pakistan's mediation to continue, rather than giving diplomacy one more day, President Trump announced a full naval blockade of Iranian ports, effective at 10 a.m. Monday morning. Now here is the paradox, and the Council on Foreign Relations flagged this very clearly. If the problem is that the strait is already blocked by Iran, how exactly does adding a second blockade solve it? That is where things start to get complicated. Let me tell you something. In my experience, when the facts are clear, the arguments get easier. So let us walk through what actually happened. The U.S. Navy deployed 15 warships. The USS Abraham Lincoln Carrier Strike Group, 11 destroyers. the USS Tripoli Amphibious Assault Group. President Trump announced it on Truth Social, warning that Iranian fast attack boats caught approaching would be, and this is his word, immediately eliminated. Within 20 minutes of the blockade taking effect, at least 2 tankers, the Rich Starry and the Austria, turned back. Both were sailing under false flags registered to landlocked nations, Malawi and Botswana. That tells you something important about the shadowy nature of the oil trade Iran has been running even during wartime. It also tells you something about the blurred line between formal state policy and gray zone commerce in a conflict like this. But here's the international reaction, and this is the part I really want you to sit with. Britain's Prime Minister Starmer said plainly, "We are not supporting the blockade." Germany said Trump's justification was not based on any new facts. Spain's defense minister called it senseless. China, and remember, 90% of Iran's oil exports go to China, called the blockade irresponsible and dangerous, and warned the United States not to meddle in their trade arrangements. Russia said the move would destabilize markets and deepen economic uncertainty. On Monday alone, Brent crude spiked another 7%, hitting $102 per barrel. Iran's military called the blockade piracy and warned that if Iranian ports were threatened, no port in the Persian Gulf would be safe. And here is an irony worth noticing. Iran has, in certain ways, actually been profiting from this war. Elevated prices have increased the value of the oil it can still move. But if the blockade holds, Tehran faces losses estimated at around $13 billion a month. That changes the equation fast. Still, with Beijing directly in the crossfire, this is no longer just about Iran. It is about whether the United States is prepared to risk confrontation with the world's second-largest economy over shipping lanes, energy flows, and enforcement power in one of the most sensitive waterways on Earth. That is a question that deserves a careful answer, not a reflexive one. Now look, every president faces hard choices. I know that better than most. But the quality of leadership is not just about the choice itself. It is about how you make it, when you make it, what alternatives you have exhausted, and whether you have thought 3 moves ahead. So let us talk about what was on the table in Islamabad. Iran was reportedly willing to discuss no nuclear weapons, long-term enrichment restrictions, surrendering fissile material, and ending proxy support. In exchange, they wanted sanctions relief, war reparations, and security guarantees. Now, were those demands reasonable? Some were not. That is what negotiation is for. Negotiation is not the art of meeting only people who already agree with you. It is the art of narrowing the distance between what each side wants and what each side can live with. But Iran's parliament speaker said the United States failed to win Iran's trust. The Iranian side said they were inches away from a deal, but the Americans had excessive demands and constantly changing positions. Now, I have negotiated with difficult adversaries. I have sat across from people whose motives I did not trust, whose systems I did not admire, and whose words I did not simply take at face value. And the lesson I learned is that you have to know the difference between what sounds tough at a press conference and what can actually be achieved at the table. What troubles me here is the sequencing. A blockade is an act of war under international law. Every serious legal scholar will tell you that. And the president launched one within hours of the talks collapsing, rather than giving Pakistan time to organize a second round. Pakistan has since proposed exactly that, another round of talks, but how do you credibly negotiate while escalating military confrontation at the same time? Vice President Vance said, "The ball is in the Iranian court." But you cannot invite someone to the table while pointing a gun at their head and still call that diplomacy. That may be coercion, it may be pressure, it may be force-backed bargaining, but it is not diplomacy in the classic sense. And pretending otherwise only muddies the public understanding of what is actually happening. And here is the contradiction that bothers me most. Just last month, the administration let a Russian oil tanker pass through the Cuba blockade framework to avoid direct confrontation with Putin. But now we are risking confrontation with Beijing by blocking China-bound tankers in the Hormuz Strait. You cannot have a strategy where you back down from one adversary and strong-arm your trade partners in another theater and call that coherence. That is not leverage. That is confusing. We have got to remember something. The strength of America has never just been about the size of our military. It is about the system, the Constitution, the alliances, the institutions, the procedures that make our word mean something in the world. And right now, that system is taking real damage. Let us start at home. Congress was on a 2-week recess when the blockade was announced. A naval blockade, which is legally considered an act of war, was declared through a social media post without congressional authorization, without a vote, without even a hearing. House Democrats have tried 4 times to force a vote on a war powers resolution to limit the president's military authority in Iran. 4 times, and 4 times Republicans have blocked it. The people's representatives are being cut out of decisions about war and peace. That is not how our system is supposed to work. Presidents have operational flexibility, yes, but the power to slide the country into a broader war without Congress meaningfully engaged, that is precisely what the constitutional structure was designed to restrain. Now let us look at the alliance damage. NATO allies are openly declining to participate. The United Kingdom, our closest partner, our so-called special relationship, is not joining the blockade. Instead, Britain and France are leading their own coalition of 40 nations, explicitly separate from the warring parties, focused on reopening the strait through diplomacy and defensive coordination. France and Britain are convening their own summit this week. Germany has said it will only help after hostilities cease, and only with a United Nations mandate. Even Israel, the one ally supporting the blockade, brings political complications rather than broad legitimacy, given its role in the strikes that triggered the crisis in the first place. Let me tell you what this means in practical terms. America's greatest asset in the world has always been its ability to lead coalitions. I built them in the Balkans, in trade negotiations, and in the fight against terrorism. When you cannot get Britain, France, Germany, or Japan to stand with you, you have not demonstrated strength. You have demonstrated that your strategy has failed the most basic test of diplomacy, persuading others that your cause is just, proportionate, and wise. And that, my friends, is an institutional failure that takes years to repair. Now, let us be honest about politics, because foreign policy never exists outside of politics. Every president knows that. The real question is whether your policy serves the national interest or whether it is increasingly shaped by a political gamble. This blockade is a gamble. It is built on the assumption that Iran will feel economic pain faster than American consumers will. But let us think about that for a moment. Iran is an authoritarian regime that has survived decades of sanctions. It has brutally crushed protests. According to human rights organizations, the regime executed at least 1,639 people in 2025 alone, the highest number since 1989. This is a government that will let its own people suffer before it blinks. America, on the other hand, is a democracy. Gas prices are already hurting families. The IEA's executive director has warned that current prices are still not reflecting the full severity of the problem, and that even if the war ended tomorrow, energy markets might not normalize for 2 years. 2 years. Midterm elections are coming, and Republicans are already vulnerable to the economy. And then there is the Pope. Pope Leo XIV, the first American-born pope, called this war truly unacceptable. And the president responded by attacking him personally, calling him weak on crime and terrible on foreign policy. Now look, I have had my disagreements with religious leaders, but picking a public fight with the Pope while your policy is already isolated internationally, that is not the behavior of someone steadily managing a crisis. That looks more like the behavior of someone who feels the walls closing in and is lashing outward rather than thinking forward. The political strategy seems to be this: escalate to force a deal, put maximum pressure on Iran, and bet that they crack. But if they do not crack, the administration has no clean off-ramp. And the longer this goes without resolution, the more the political cost falls on American households at the pump at the grocery store, and in their retirement accounts. That is the calculation I would be worried about if I were sitting in that Oval Office right now. So let me walk you through what I see as the most likely path forward, because this is the part where we have to stop reacting and start thinking. Scenario A: Iran blinks. The economic pressure of losing $13 billion a month forces Tehran back to the table, and a deal is struck before the ceasefire expires around April 22nd. That is what President Trump is betting on. But the Council on Foreign Relations concluded, and I quote, "I wouldn't bet against Iran. This is a regime that has endured far worse." Scenario B: Escalation. Iran retaliates militarily using its remaining IRGC fast attack boats, drones, missiles, or by activating the Houthis to close the Bab el-Mandeb Strait in the Red Sea, creating a two-strait crisis. Saudi pipeline routes get threatened. The global economy enters a full-blown energy shock. Some economists warn oil could hit $170 a barrel. That is not a recession. That is a catastrophe. Scenario C: Trump blinks. Facing rising domestic pressure, falling approval, and allied isolation, the administration quietly softens its demands, perhaps allowing limited Iranian enrichment under international monitoring, and declares victory anyway. Now, this president has reversed course before and branded it a win. I would not count that out. Scenario D: the long stalemate. Competing blockades and partial restrictions grind on. Energy prices remain elevated. The global economy suffers a slow bleed, and this crisis becomes the defining issue of the midterm elections. My honest assessment? The most likely path is some combination of C and D. A messy, face-saving partial retreat, dressed up as toughness, dragged out over weeks. But here is the danger. The longer this goes, the more the world starts building workarounds that exclude America: alternative trade routes, alternative currencies, alternative energy arrangements, alternative diplomatic alignments, and that, friends, is the real long-term threat to American power. Let me close with something personal. I am not standing here saying Iran is an innocent party. It is not. Its human rights record is abysmal. Its nuclear ambitions are genuinely dangerous. Its closure of the strait was provocative and illegal. And the goals here: denuclearization, regional stability, freedom of navigation, those are legitimate goals. I want to be crystal clear about that. But the method matters. A unilateral blockade announced on social media, without allies, without Congress, without a credible diplomatic off-ramp, that is the wrong method. And when you use the wrong method to pursue the right goal, you often end up further from where you wanted to be, not closer. There is a difference between strength and stubbornness. Real strength is what Britain and France are doing right now: building coalitions, planning defensive naval missions, keeping the door open for diplomacy. Real strength is what Pakistan is doing, proposing a second round of talks even after the first round failed. That takes patience. That takes humility. Those are not weaknesses. Those are among the hardest forms of leadership there are. I remember moments in my own presidency: Bosnia, the Middle East, the budget fights, when I had to swallow my pride and choose the harder path of compromise over the easier thrill of confrontation. It was never the most satisfying option at the moment. It was never the option that produced the loudest applause, but it was very often the right one in the long run. The measure of a great nation is not whether it can project power. Any country with enough weapons can do that. The measure of a great nation is whether it can project wisdom, whether it can lead not by fear alone, but by example, whether it can combine strength with restraint, confidence with discipline, and power with legitimacy. That is the America I believe in. And I think, if you are being honest with yourself tonight, that is the America you believe in too. So stay engaged, watch what happens, hold your leaders accountable, all of them, in both parties. Demand both strength and wisdom, because a system only works if we make it work. And I still believe, I have always believed, that the American people, when they have the facts, will make the right call. Thank you for listening.